CEO Clinton Ephron has been testifying at the State Capture Commission of Inquiry. This is on the business rescue of Optimum Coal. That was before it was acquired by Tegeta with Eskom's help in the late 2015. Our reporter Aaron Bates is there covering the story for us. Aaron, good afternoon. Let's perhaps go a little bit to where exactly he began when he talked about that acquisition of Optimum Coal.
Yes, Kathy, we're building up to how Glencore lost control of Optimum and how Tegeta acquired it. We're really hitting crunch point now with Clinton Ephron, who was the CEO of Optimum for Glencore in 2015, when Tegeta managed to strong-arm Eskom into helping it buy Optimum. And he's described this sudden change in board at the beginning of 2015 and the fact that negotiations were underway to amend the coal supply agreement between Optimum and Eskom, because they were having challenges with supplying coal to the power utility. But in comes a new board, and after much effort to get a meeting, Ephron learns that the addendum, which had seemingly been on its way to being agreed to between Eskom and Optimum, was off the table. And this sudden change of heart from the power utility was, to him, he said, devastating. And of course, this is the beginning of paving the way for Tegeta to acquire Optimum with a 600 million rand prepayment, quote unquote, from Eskom.
Let's talk about the details, because we know how much Eskom then paid Tegeta in terms of that prepayment. But how far were they willing to go? Give us the nitty-gritty of what he said before the commission, some of that detail.
Kathy, in terms of some of the details, the nitty-gritty, I'll give you some numbers on tonnage for coal, because one of the issues is that Eskom and Optimum had an agreement per ton of coal. They had to supply a minimum of 3.5 tons per year, and that could increase up to a total of about 5 million tons per year, per month, Kathy. Please forgive me. You want the nitty-gritty, there are a lot of numbers, it gets quite complicated. But what Eskom and Optimum under Glencore wanted to do was change their agreement to allow for an increase to 550 rand per ton of coal. As I said, 3.5 million rands at least. That was the minimum tonnage that Optimum was required to supply to Eskom per month. And it had at the time been 130 rand. So they really wanted to bump up the cost per ton, or the payment per ton, because they were struggling to make ends meet at Optimum. But I don't want to keep our guest, political analyst Karima Brown, waiting too long. You've spoken about the nitty-gritty, Kathy. Well, one of the interesting things to come out of testimony today is that President Cyril Ramaphosa, when he was out of politics, was actually the BEE partner when Glencore acquired Optimum, and this through a company called Lexcel, which had about a 9% stake in Glencore's acquisition of the mine. Karima, that's a very interesting point I think a lot of people miss about the history of Optimum and Glencore's relationship to the mine. And I, interestingly, tweeted that and then found someone with the account for Atul Gupta on Twitter, and one never knows if these are true or not, liking that comment. So that's seemingly playing into the minds of people who are very critical about what happened with Glencore and Optimum.
Look, what we must accept is that there's a contest about what happened, and there continues to be a contestation of narrative about who's responsible for what. And of course, what the Gupta-aligned group in the African National Congress and the executives at Eskom wants to suggest is that they wanted to bring in new players. They wanted to bring in empowerment players, and of course, the fact that Cyril Ramaphosa was a BEE partner adds to this fact that Cyril Ramaphosa is somehow the puppet of white monopoly capital and fronts for that. And that, of course, is why someone like Atul Gupta would like your comment, because it fits the narrative very neatly, in that way. What is surprising for me is, of course, the speed with which Brian Molefe moved in terms of changing the board. And, of course, what we need to look at is the bigger picture. In the betrayal of the promise, the academics who studied the phenomena of state capture gives us the MO of how these people operated. So what they would do is they would strong-arm you first. If you can't be strong-armed or bribed, then you would have a commission of inquiry instituted against you, and then you'd be removed. And then, of course, the people who are in the positions of power rewrite the rules, and, of course, the deals go through. And this wasn't just the case with Eskom. This was, of course, the case with the SABC, with Denal, and everybody else. But I think Eskom is the kind of poster child for the extent to which the Guptas were prepared to actually, take over and, of course, move. And we've had a lot of ministers, for example, speaking on this. I remember Nwako Ramatlodi, for example, saying that he was phoned by Enoch Godongwana saying, you're going to be replaced by a Gupta minister. And we know that Musibenzi Zwane was appointed 9 o'clock at night with a 2-paragraph statement, and everyone was caught by surprise. And what you see here, as you correctly explained to Kathy, is this build-up to this eventual takeover. And of course, following this, and I suppose that's going to happen this afternoon after lunch, we're going to be hearing more and more about the way in which Glencore is now going to be leaned on. And the person, of course, that becomes central and emerges is Musibenzi Zwane. So I think it's important when we look at Eskom is to place it within that project, that political project of state capture. And of course, Eskom was the key issue. You must also remember that there was the big argument, and Brian Molefe made it very recently on Politburo, that for base load we needed nuclear, and that Eskom should have been that organization to facilitate it. And we know, of course, that there are rumors that the Russians have already paid, and that President Jacob Zuma is under the gun and has to make good on those contracts. And of course, that's eventually the reason why Finance Minister at the time, Minister Nene, was fired. So this is actually quite a granular, brick by brick explanation of how you get to a point where eventually the Guptas are able to obtain, the company, and Glencore signs. You will also note that the change in just protocols, for example, that has been established for things like 25 years, just suddenly changes. Now, of course, the narrative of radical economic transformation was that we can't just have whites controlling these interests, and the blacks that are there are in fact just fronters, like, for example, Cyril Ramaphosa. So I think that the fight for what happened at Eskom is far from over, but what is very clear here is that standard rules, procedures that were agreed to both by Eskom and by Glencore were ignored. And of course, when Eskom couldn't get their way, you begin to see the strong arm tactics. And I think that for me is quite fascinating, because it is almost a classic study in how state capture operated.
Yes. And we heard from Ephron how much he struggled to get a meeting with Molefe, eventually getting this meeting in, I think it is April of 2015 at Megawatt Park, during which Eskom seems to do a 360 on allowing for this addendum 4 it is, on negotiating a new price for the coal.
Absolutely, and I think this is the key issue here. When the academics describe state capture, they don't just describe it as ordinary corruption. They talk about an actual political project. They talk about the extent to which the patronage network was worked out from snout to tail. And so you would have, for example, people below, let's say, Mr. Molefe, passing through information. And that is, of course, what happened at a lot of these institutions. People were coerced into doing what was patently illegal, which was irregular, and, of course, the big, people involved have plausible deniability. Mr. Brian Molefe's attitude at that meeting gives you an impression and gives you an indication that he believes he has political cover for what he is going to do, and that, it's a matter of time before they get Glencore to do precisely what they want them to do. So when we look at these commissions, it's actually quite important to just locate them within the political project that was state capture, and Eskom, of course, was the big prize.
Yes, Karima, you talk about tail to snout. Kathy, I would say we're probably about in the guts of that metaphor at this point. We're in the middle of Eskom, in the heartbeat of the economy of South Africa and its power supply. And it's quite possible that we'll get right up to the head to the political principles in mineral resources, the likes of former Minister Mosebenzi Zwane, as we go into the afternoon of Ephron's testimony.
All right, Aaron, thanks for that update. That's where we leave it with Aaron Bates for now. And, of course, more will continue at the State Capture Commission of Inquiry after their lunchtime break. Well,